In the previous video, we created a database inside the phpMyAdmin, which contains a MySQL database. Now, in this video, I'll show you how to create a connection between the database we have in the phpMyAdmin and our project. Now, to create a database, we need to create a connection, and that connection will be placed inside a file. The first thing we need to do is we need to create a file inside the config folder, because I said earlier that the config folder will hold the file that has the connection between our project and the database. Now, click on the config folder, create a new file. You can give it any name, but it needs to have the .php extension. In this case, I'll just give it a simple name, call it db.php. It's a very short name. Now we have this file inside the config folder. Now the first thing we need to do inside this file is to write the PHP tags, the PHP open and close tags. So we do that by typing then PHP, then we need to close the tags. Now we have the open and close PHP tags. Now after this, the next thing we need to do, we need to create the connection. But before we create the connection, we need to understand that the host that we are using is called localhost, as I've mentioned a couple of times. Then the localhost has a default username, which is called root, and an empty password, because we have not set any password in our database. But we are not going to do that. We'll just leave the password as empty, and also the default username as root. So to do so, we just create some strings and save this. We create some variables and save these values into those variables. Now the first thing we need to write is the name of the host, and here we can call it localhost, which is the name of the host of our server. The next thing is we write the username, or we can call it user, which is root, is the default username. Then the password, we call it pass, but in this case it's empty. Just leave it the way it is. Then the next thing we need to do is we need to create a variable and store the name of the database in it. Now we call the variable db underscore name, and our database name is called CRUD app. We have this. Then the next thing, we need to create a connection. Now in this project, we are going to be making use of MySQLi, because the MySQL function or method is deprecated. So we're going to be using MySQLi. Now to create a connection to the database using these variables that we've created, or these parameters we've created, we'll use MySQLi underscore connect function. Now to do that, we store it inside a variable, and we'll call that variable connection, say equal to MySQLi underscore connect. Then we pass in all the variables we created. The first variable we are going to pass in is the host, which is the local host. The next thing is going to be the user. Then we pass in the password, in this case pass, and the last thing is going to be the db underscore name. Now with this, with this MySQLi underscore connect, we've created a connection between our projects and the database using these parameters. But now we need to test to see if the connection is actually successful, because there might be times whereby an error might occur, and if there's nothing to tell us that there's an error, we might just keep finding it difficult to debug. So to do that, we'll use an if statement. And also we need to note that this my connection variable here is acting as a Boolean variable, and we know a Boolean variable only has two values, either true or false. Now what we need to do is we need to use an if conditional statement. So we say if connection then what this means is we are saying if the connection is true, then we need to echo connection successful. Else, if there's an error, we need to throw an error to alert the user to know that there's an error. And see echo connection failed. Connection failed. Now to view this page to see if the connection was successful or not, we just go to the right hand side and click on the live preview button. When we click on it, it's going to launch a new browser and it will show us whether the connection was successful or not. Now in this case, we can see that the connection was successful because every parameter that we passed in, they are correct. Now what about a case whereby there's a mistake somewhere? Maybe the database name was not correct, or the host was not properly written, or the username was not properly written. Let's see what happens if we remove a letter from the database name. We save, then we go to the page. Wow, we see that we get an error, a MySQL_connect. It says unknown database with this name, CRUD app with a P missing. Now it says connection failed. Why? Because there's an error, the database name is not correct. But if we have the correct name, then we go back, it's going to show us connection was successful. But we should notice that if we leave it this way, we just whatever page we call this config file or this db.php file, we will always be having this echo statement, this connection was successful. So we want a case whereby we only see a message where the connection was not successful or where there's an error in the connection. Now to do that, we just have to remove this else statement, and after removing this else statement, there's a PHP function that we can use called die. It's called die. Then what it takes is it takes a message and also it takes another PHP error function. So here we can type connection to DB failed. Then we concatenate with this PHP error function. Now this PHP error function takes a parameter, and the parameter is the connection. So we'll say my SQLi underscore error, which takes the parameter connection. Now with this, and there's one more thing we need to do. Now if we try to launch this, we're going to get the message connection to DB failed. Let's try and see. Now it says connection to DB failed. Why? Because it says if connection is true, that is if the connection is true, then we get this message. But a case whereby the connection fails, what we need to do is we say if the connection is false, then we need to get this error message. And how do we do that? We just put a blank sign or an exclamation in front of the connection. So this shows that if the variable is false, then we get this message. Now if we go back to our browser, we'll see that the message has disappeared. Now, if we refresh, we see that the message has disappeared. So with this, we have successfully connected to our database, creating a file called db.php. From the next section, we start writing our HTML codes, and we'll create our different pages, and we'll also write our PHP codes.